Hi, my name is Peter Giuliano, Chief Research Officer for the Specialty Coffee Association. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we at SCAA have been using surveys to document the impact of the pandemic on the specialty coffee community. Today, my colleague Katie Jane von der Lieth and I will present some data, learnings, and insights from these surveys. Our hope is that these insights will help coffee businesses cope with the ongoing crisis and gain inspiration from other businesses' experience. We're grateful to Pacific Barista Series, who supported this work for the entire year through both sponsorship and collaboration. Thanks, Pacific. So to begin, I'd like to introduce Katie Jane von der Lieth, who led this research.
Hey everyone, I'm pleased to be here with you all virtually to share the results from our third and most recent survey about the impact of COVID-19 on the specialty coffee community. I'll start off by sharing some survey methodology and data characterizing the survey respondents. Then I'll go through some of the more interesting results from the survey, and Peter will follow with some additional analysis and key takeaways. Over the past year, we've launched a series of 3 surveys, one in March 2020, one in June 2020, and the most recent one in March 2021. The 3 surveys were almost identical in content, and by asking the same question at 3 different points in time, this allows us to make some comparisons and see how the responses changed throughout time. Each survey was open between 1 and 2 weeks, and though we launched the surveys in several languages, including English, Spanish, Korean, traditional, and simplified Chinese, the results we'll be sharing in this video focus on the responses from those who completed the survey in English. So keep an eye out for future SCAA events and outputs sharing the results from those other language groups. One important item I want to note is that these results are meant to be a snapshot in time, and they're intended to be illustrative and highlight general trends. Okay, now that I've covered the survey methodology, let's get a better understanding of who actually responded to our survey. So below the number of respondents for each survey is a list of the top 5 most represented countries. As you can see, the United States was consistently the most represented country for all of the surveys. The number 2 through 5 spots varied for each survey, though Canada and the United Kingdom were in the top 5 every time. We asked survey respondents from the United States to share their zip codes, and then we mapped those zip codes to get a sense of where respondents were coming from. You can see that we got folks from almost every state, though we are missing some, and there's definitely a concentration in major urban areas. Looking at the different types of businesses that responded, you can see that the top 3 categories across all the surveys were retailers, roaster retailers, and roaster wholesalers. Of those who identified as having retail space, the retailers and roaster retailers, we asked how many outlets they had. Smaller retail operations, with just 1 retail outlet, comprised the majority of retail survey respondents, though we had consistent representation from retail businesses with 6 or more outlets. Okay, now that we've gotten to know our survey respondents a little bit better, let's start digging into the results. The first question, after asking about folks' roles and locations, was we asked survey takers to assess the overall impact of the coronavirus pandemic on their organizations. The available options range from existentially negative to significantly positive, with a gradient of options in between. And we also gave folks the options to say that they were unsure. So this graph here displays data from all 3 surveys. The leftmost bar for each response option, or the darkest blue bar, is data from the first survey we did in March 2020. The middle bars represent the June 2020 survey, and the rightmost bars, the purple ones, is data from the most recent survey that we did in March 2021. What I find most striking in this data is the decrease over time in the proportion of respondents who indicated that their businesses were significantly negatively affected by the pandemic. In March 2020, 57% of respondents said that their businesses were significantly negatively affected, but by March 2021, this dropped to 40% of respondents. So although it's clear that many respondents have been negatively affected by the pandemic, as we would imagine, we can see that sentiment among English-speaking respondents is less severe than it was a year ago. So I want to pause here for a moment and ruminate on what might be driving these results being the decrease in the proportion of respondents that are being significantly negatively affected. I think there's two likely drivers of this trend. The first is that it's possible that this positive shift in sentiment about the impact of the pandemic is a result of folks overcoming the initial shock of shelter-in-place orders that started around March 2020. And those folks have continued to adapt and maybe even thrive in this new normal. On the other hand, what we could be seeing is something called sample selection bias. That is, there's a chance that some of the businesses that responded existentially negative to our first survey in March 2020 have since closed. And if those closed businesses did not complete the survey in March 2021, as we might imagine, that could be skewing our results more positively, since in that case, we'd only be showing responses from the businesses that continue to stay in business during the pandemic. And it could also be a little bit of both. Some businesses are getting better at adapting, and some sample selection bias. This is something that we should keep in mind throughout the duration of these results. With that aside out of the way, let's look at the next slide. The next slide shows data about the percent loss of sales that respondents' businesses experienced as a result of the pandemic. Like the previous slide, the leftmost bar for each category is data from the March 2020 survey, the middle bar from the June 2020 survey, and the rightmost bar is data from the March 2021 survey. Also, like the previous slide, we can see that in general, responses are reporting more positively than they were a year ago. We can see a shift from the more severe losses in sales categories on the right, such as the 100% loss of sales and the 75 to 99% loss of sales, and an increase in those reporting smaller amounts of losses on the lower end of the spectrum, especially in the 0 to 15% loss in sales category, which is highlighted on this slide. This next slide shows responses to the question, which of the following impacts has your organization experienced or do you anticipate experiencing? And respondents were given a list of options and asked to select all options that applied to them. And some folks also wrote in responses. For several of the options, you can see that there wasn't much change across time. For example, approximately the same percentage of respondents are canceling events and experiencing increased legal and insurance fees, but there are notable changes in two categories. The first category is reduced customer demand, which dropped by 10% from March 2020 to March 2021. So though reduced customer demand continues to be an issue for the majority of respondents, it's been progressively less prevalent among English-speaking respondents. In reading the open-ended responses to this question, it's clear that there is a small group of folks who are actually experiencing increasing customer demand, especially in online sales channels and delivery. The second notable change across time worth highlighting is the increase of respondents in experiencing a shortage of supplies, which, as you can see, has steadily increased from March 2020 from about a quarter of respondents to over a third of respondents from our March 2021 survey. We also asked folks how their expenses were changing and what was driving those changes. And below are the top 5 results of sources of increased expenses for each survey. There's an interesting shift going on here in the top responses as the pandemic and our understanding of it has continually evolved. PPE, or personal protective equipment, a word that was most likely not in a lot of our vernaculars in March 2020, didn't appear as an increased expense in our first survey, but it was in the number 1 spot in our June and March 2021 survey after we learned more about the best practices on disease prevention. Shipping also appears for the first time in June 2020, which we can probably connect to the increase in home delivery as customers shifted buying patterns from in-person to online. Finally, and perhaps related to the shortage in supplies response we saw in the previous question, we see that both supplies and products in the second and third spot for our March 2021 survey. If we combine those two categories, supplies and products actually surpasses PPE as the number one most mentioned source of increased expenses. For this next question, we asked folks to forecast a bit into the future. This question asked respondents to gauge where their sales would be in the next 3, 6, and 9 months. Using their pre-COVID-19 revenue as a baseline, the response options were 25%, 50%, and 75% of pre-COVID sales, back to pre-COVID sales, or above pre-COVID sales. For this next question, we asked folks to forecast into the future a little bit. This question asked respondents to gauge where their sales would be in the next 3, 6, and 9 months. Using their pre-COVID-19 revenue as a baseline, the response options were 25% of pre-COVID sales, 50% of pre-COVID sales, 75% of pre-COVID sales, and back to pre-COVID sales, and above pre-COVID sales. We didn't ask this question in the first survey, so here I'll just compare the June 2020 results to the March 2021 results. Looking at the 3-month expectations for revenue, we can see that the majority of folks in June 2020 were in the 25 to 50% of pre-COVID revenue range, noted by the two almost equally sized bars on the left. Moving to the 6-month outlook, the responses shift to the right, with most folks responding with 50% and 75% of pre-COVID revenue. And finally, revenue expectations for 9 months shift even further to the right, and in fact about half of English-speaking respondents expected their sales to be equal to or above pre-COVID revenue in June 2020. Now let's look at data from that same question, except this time for the March 2021 survey. It's clear that at the time of asking this question, folks were feeling even more optimistic about their sales outlook, especially at the 9-month time mark, with more than 50% of respondents expecting to be at or above their pre-COVID revenue, and the most common response for this time period was about pre-COVID revenue. Let's dig into this question just a little bit deeper because it's an important question. Looking at just the 9-month time horizon, but just looking at the retailers, let's disaggregate the data by the number of retail outlets. Contrary to what some might imagine, there doesn't seem to be a big notable difference of outlook amongst the different size retailers, at least at the 9-month time horizon. We see that across all sizes of businesses, around 50% of folks expect to be at or above pre-COVID sales. Meanwhile, just over 10% of folks anticipate revenues of 25% of pre-COVID sales. All right, everyone, that's it for me. I'll hand it off now to Peter, who will walk us through some of the key takeaways from this survey.
In addition to the quantitative questions that Katie Jane just reported on, we also asked a number of open-ended questions that allowed us to get a little more detail about how individual members of our community are faring under current conditions. These questions focused on drawing out specific challenges and obstacles our community is facing, and the solutions and opportunities they've used to navigate successfully. The goal here is to share our trials and our triumphs. Now, before we begin, I want to express gratitude to everyone who participated so generously in this part of the survey. I was impressed and inspired to read the stories of members of our community in their own words. So let's begin with some challenges and obstacles. The first major theme we noticed was around frustration with government restrictions on business, and specifically their unpredictability. Lack of clarity around what was permitted and what was not seemed to be a common frustration expressed by respondents. At the same time, government aid programs were seen as an essential and important way to keep the doors open for business. One respondent expressed it this way: "Unfortunately, we are at a stage in Montana and probably elsewhere where solely brick-and-mortar businesses are facing a tough decision between safe, legal practices to follow COVID guidelines while dramatically harming revenue and viability, or disregarding safe, required COVID guidelines, but having a successful business year. Without readily available and understandable aid, it is harder and harder for businesses to follow the guidelines while using revenue." The second major theme we heard about were challenges around managing consumer expectations and behavior in a changed environment. Community members described challenges enforcing mask rules, the need for employee safety and physical separation between customers and staff, and the challenges in providing compassionate, excellent service under stressful circumstances. One participant expressed it this way: "We've never experienced so many difficult guest interactions in our 7 years of business as we have this year. And making sure our team felt, 1, prepared to handle it, and 2, knew that we had their backs was crucial." A third major theme we heard about was issues surrounding increased costs and supply shortages. Many increased costs were associated with safety equipment like PPE and disinfection supplies. To our surprise, we did not hear anything about increased costs of modifying ventilation systems or rent issues. We did, however, hear concern about green coffee shortages, increased coffee prices, and increased shipping costs for supplies like packaging. This concern, of course, will have increased in the recent weeks as shipping container shortages and overland shipping costs have increased significantly at the global level. Finally, the major theme we heard was about fatigue and mental health. This has been an exhausting year for our whole community, and we heard a clear and moving expression of extreme psychological fatigue and the need for mental health strategies in the workplace. Many respondents, though proud of their achievements over this past year, seem to be at a kind of breaking point, seriously in need of some rest and mental health strategies. One respondent expressed it this way: "It's been hard to stay open, emotionally draining on employees. While I'm proud to have been able to keep my employees physically and financially safe, I could not protect them from the emotional toll." Turning now to successful strategies and achievements, respondents were especially generous in this regard, sharing strategies that worked for them in the hope that they might be of use to other members of our community. The most prominent theme, by a long shot, was about community engagement and making business decisions according to the needs of an established, supportive customer base. The dynamic of community engagement, followed by customer loyalty and support, was repeated over and over, showing that an engaged community was seen as an essential asset to survival and even growth during these turbulent times. Now, it should be noted that this was mentioned far more often than product quality, suggesting that a key competitive advantage this year was community engagement and relationship building among the clientele. One respondent put it simply: "We've kept being there for our customers, and they've responded with rabid loyalty." A second prominent theme was similar, but about listening to staff as well as customers. A competent, dedicated, supportive staff was seen as a major asset this year, and many respondents expressed the benefit of the business being especially supportive in terms of pay, medical support, safety, and schedule flexibility. Many respondents saw staff creativity and dedication as the key to thriving in the current business climate. One respondent put it this way: "Listen to your team. Make sure everyone on your team is comfortable and supply accurate and realistic expectations of what the work environment will be like." We had many people who thought they'd be okay working in a COVID environment, but who ended up not being comfortable working in COVID in a food environment. A third theme was about advertising and marketing. A year ago, we discussed the advantages of advertising during business slowdowns, and some respondents acted on that strategy, seeking benefits in advertising, marketing, and communications during COVID-affected business periods. One respondent said, "We tried to advertise our reopening as aggressively as possible, reoriented our furniture, and put in place COVID-safe policies so that customers felt safe as in-house dining became allowed. We've run more promotions to try and drive traffic in." The final theme is about internet-based business. During the COVID era, many companies pivoted to an internet and app-based business strategies. No particular format was seen as successful. Instead, many businesses described a spirit of experimentation to discover which strategies, from home delivery to subscription sales platforms to delivery apps, would work for their business. It seemed that the spirit of experimentation with technology platforms and business models was more important than any one approach. Here's one take. Anticipate that consumer behaviors have changed. Folks will want delivery and curbside moving forward, and many of them will continue using the third-party delivery apps. So in analyzing the quantitative data, we noticed that roughly a quarter of retailers in our survey described minimal, neutral, or even positive impacts to their business this year. From a positive impact to a maximum 15% or so loss in revenue. We decided to take a deeper look at these businesses, we'll call them less impacted retailers, to see what they had in common and see if any lessons could be drawn from their experiences. The first and most obvious commonality less impacted retailers had was their geographic location. Among those less impacted retailers who provided their postal code, roughly 90% were in primarily residential areas, often suburbs. This provided evidence for a long-anticipated phenomenon. That as working from home continues to be a major cultural shift, coffee shops in residential areas will benefit. Additionally, the emphasis that these less impacted retailers made on community engagement suggests that the strategy of identifying and satisfying the needs of a specific community is a good one. Less impacted retailers were much less likely to have ever closed from other respondents. 79% of them never closed, as opposed to 43% of the larger retailer population. Those who were more negatively impacted often used the word lockdown, suggesting that at one point they felt forced to close. Less impacted businesses also seemed more likely to have pivoted quickly to a takeout model and more likely to mention community engagement. Less impacted businesses were not significantly different than others in terms of size, so it doesn't appear that size of the business was an important factor here. Okay, so we're still learning more, and we're eager to hear from our community in terms of what is helpful here and what insights resonate. Thanks again to Pacific Foods Barista Series and Katie Jane Vonderleith for their commitment to this project. And thank you for watching. I'm Peter Giuliano. Hello, I'm Peter Giuliano again. Thanks for watching. And here, there you are, Katie. Thanks for that. That was great. One of the things as we wait for, we want to encourage people to ask any questions or any discussion to have. But in the meantime, Katie, I thought maybe we'd reflect a little bit, you and I, on this project and also what we learned doing it. So as I was watching you, I was curious, it's been about a year since we, realized that we needed to have a listening mechanism for our community during that time. You've had experience in your previous kind of work and life and research in listening to communities. And I'm interested in, first of all, how you reflect on that first survey that we did a year ago, and also what the sort of experience of both designing the survey and interpreting the results have been.
Yeah, I think even as I was reflecting on reading through the results from this most recent survey, it's just such a good way to hear what's going on in the community, especially in the open-ended responses, just to see what people are going through, especially as we are socially distanced. I felt like I could almost hear people's voices when I was reading the responses. I think you maybe experienced a little bit of this too. But yeah, I just felt connected to people, and to see even some of my experiences reflected in folks' responses was really interesting. And yeah, something I wasn't expecting was feeling a little bit connected to these people that I hadn't met, but just reading what they're going through was really interesting. I think just the process of asking folks questions in and of itself, regardless of the data, is a really valuable process. I think people want to feel heard. I think people want to be able to have a chance to share their experiences. And it's, I feel, honored to be able to collect those experiences and share them back with the community. So I think even, outside of COVID, in any one of your endeavors, it's just a good practice to occasionally reach out, whether it's through a survey or informally to your customers, and just ask them open-endedly, like, how's it going? What are you working on? What's new?
One of the things that we didn't mention in this update, but we did in a previous update, is that we were inspired to begin this thing in the chaos of the early weeks of COVID. A friend of ours who's called Carla Martin, she's a professor at Harvard, she's an anthropologist,
and is also the executive director of the Fine Cacao and Chocolate Institute, designed she called it a flash poll of what was happening in the chocolate and the fine chocolate and cacao industry. And when we saw that, we based a lot of the structure of our survey on her survey. And she had in turn based a lot of her survey on the kind of polls that have been done for the last half century by mutual benefit associations. And mutual benefit associations have a long history, and the SCAA is one, but they have a long history for groups of people, whether they be business communities or other kinds of communities, who need to get a sense of what the community is facing together. And just like you just said, I feel like these are, it's really important that we don't guess at what people are going through, and instead have a sort of a method of amplifying individual voices and then collecting them in a way that we can make coherent sense. And it's funny because it's so easy to get misled by the way that we collect information. I'm thinking about social media and the news media, because we can make assumptions about what other people are going through basis on what we're going through or what we're seeing or hearing or whatever. And one thing that I really liked about this process was that it wasn't free from bias, as you mentioned in your talk, but it was at least quantitative in some way and allowed us to see through the noise a little bit, Anyway, that's something that I noticed a lot. Somebody asked about the most surprising result of the survey, and I'd love to know your feedback, but maybe I'll start, which was that we expected I expected the strong expression of anxiety and pain and negative impact to the business. What I didn't expect were the number one, the people who were kind of thriving, and they were a minority, but they were there. And then also the sort of commitment to resilience and survival that we were hearing a lot of. And that was contrasted so much by what was happening, being reported in the media. There were all these stories about this is the end of the independent specialty coffee shop. It's going to lead to a collapse in the industry. And at the same time, we were hearing the voices of the industry themselves saying, we're surviving and here's how. And that there was a contrast there. And that was the biggest surprise to me. What about you?
Yeah, I think definitely the fact that we saw that some people were doing well. I feel like right now it feels, I don't know, you feel bad saying that like my business is doing really well when there's a global pandemic. Even if someone asks me, hey, how are you doing today? I say, oh, I'm great. And I'm like, well, global pandemic. But so yeah, I think seeing that in the numbers was super interesting. I think the other thing that I found interesting was I was actually a little bit worried in this last survey that we wouldn't get new results or there wouldn't be something that was different than from what was going on in June 2020. But I was very wrong. And we did see a lot of a shift in what folks were experiencing. It seems like generally people who are still responding to our surveys have continued to pivot, move online. Mental health was definitely much more of an issue that was mentioned this time. But at the same time, I think that folks are kind of looking forward very much. I think people are ready to be done with the pandemic. And even, I don't think I mentioned this, but we had a smaller number of folks that responded to our survey this time. And I think that in itself is a data point that maybe people are saying like, oh, I felt like I've been heard, or I'm ready to kind of move on from COVID and start looking forward and seeing what's next. So that was really heartening.
Another thing that struck me was, and I mentioned this in my little talk, was the generosity of people in sharing, particularly what worked for them. people put real effort into telling us in some detail about what was working for their business and what wasn't. And that enabled us to take that information, and I'm saying the larger us, not just you and I, but everybody at the SCAA and the community, to take that information and turn it into tools and lessons and education things and webinars that people could use, and but that generosity and sharing in the first place, it took a significant amount of time to fill out the survey, and especially during a time when people are exhausted in the first place. And I'm just it's something that kept coming back to me, was how this community, was interested in lifting each other up during a difficult time, and that's something that stayed with me. So we've got some. I could talk about surprises in the survey, and I think we'll maybe come back to some later. But we've got some more questions. The question: will you continue this type of survey, and how do you expect it to evolve? Why don't you take that, Katie, first?
Yeah, I think we won't do this exact type of survey. As I've mentioned, I think people are ready to continue talking about a different topic other than COVID, but I definitely think that there was a ton of value in just asking our community, like I mentioned, what are you going through? How are things going for you? What's on your mind? It's just such a valuable exercise to sort of systematically listen to our community. I don't think surveys is the only way to do that. I think it's one piece of the puzzle, but I hope that we continue this specific type of listening mechanism, in addition to other community outreach events that we do, just talking to folks that But I definitely see that we will continue to, systematically through surveys, listen to our community. In terms of evolving, I wonder, Peter, do you want to take that part
sure.
on, how it might evolve?
Sure. I'll mention that even pre-COVID, we had adopted a strategy at SCAA to listen more and listen better. I always abbreviate it as Project Listen because of something I mentioned earlier. It's easy. I think early in the days of social media, one of the things that we told ourselves about social media is, oh my gosh, it's going to be so much easier to listen to people, And then there became this habit that happens on social media is when somebody has I'm sure most people watching this have experienced, somebody has a bad experience in your coffee shop or whatever, they're tweeting about it to get their customer service, But what we've learned, I think, especially in the past couple of years, is that the weirdness of the algorithms of social media can really distort what people, and it makes it not such a perfect listening mechanism. That's not to say that it has no value. It just is unique in its way. And so we had adopted a strategy already of trying to find new ways to listen to our community. Surveys are one way to listen. And as you say, they're systematic and they can be very, very powerful. But the evolution, I think, is very important. And I think surveys are, I agree with you, I think, and I hope, and we will continue to do different kinds of surveys. We recently did, and you led, along with colleagues, Rukia Del Rue and Mario Fernandez, led a survey addressing how people use the cupping form, the SCAA cupping methodology. And that's a whole different subject, but the same tool. And one thing I like to tell people is that you can learn, when you do a survey, you can learn things about other subjects besides what you asked people about. People will, because of that generosity thing that I was talking about a few minutes ago, people will tell you all about what they're facing, what they're struggling with, even if it goes off topic of the survey. And so I think you mentioned the power of the open-ended things, and I think we're going to get better at doing that. So instead of checking, off a list of things, they'll be more open-ended, and we'll get better at interpreting open-ended responses. And because you can do that methodologically as well. And so I think that we'll probably use technology to hear people's voices as whole voices rather than having them check boxes on a survey. I think that's what the evolution looks like. Yeah, and I'm excited about the way that technology can help amplify people's voices, particularly people's voices who have trouble getting heard in the first place. And I think that's something that we really need to evolve, is listening better to voices that we haven't always heard very well before. In particular, I know that there was, in the COVID context, there was a lot of concern about the coffee supply chain and the producing side. And although we did intentionally reach out to the coffee producing community, we didn't gather as much information there as I hoped we would. And that's particularly, I think we need to develop some tools that are better at collecting that kind of information.
Yeah, I totally agree.
On supply, the next question's about supply chain. How useful, I'm going to try to interpret this here. How useful experience in supply chain management? Oh, how useful is experience in supply chain management for a retail cafe? I think I'll start with that. I think right now, like at this moment, there's some things that are kind of timeless in these surveys and some things that are timely. I think the feedback that we got on supply chains was really timely right now. I think people right now in coffee are struggling with supplies. That includes coffee, that includes, non-coffee consumables like, plant milk and paper cups and stuff. And so it includes food. On the one hand, I think supply chains proved in COVID to be very resilient. I think people were very worried about supply chains at the beginning of the pandemic, stockpiling toilet paper, et cetera. Then the supply chains, I'm talking globally, not just for coffee, seem to be much more resilient. But now I think we're suffering some aftershocks, the container shortage, things like that are worrying people. So I think although supply chains are in general more resilient than many people feared, I think there is a need for people to be much more skilled in understanding and engaging with their supply chains so that they don't have a disruption. And because disruptions can really mess up a business. What do you think about that?
I think that, I totally agree. At the beginning in March 2020, there was a lot of concern, especially in the food supply chain, that there would be really intense disruptions. And given the global nature of the food supply chain, I think I was surprised myself at how resilient we were. I think one of the challenges with, global pandemics and these really big things like climate change that are hard for individuals to wrap our head around is that we're not really good at risk management for those things. It's difficult for us to conceptualize the probability of something like this happening. And then, and because we don't assess that risk well, we don't plan for that risk well. So I think moving forward, now that we've all experienced this, maybe building that risk management and a better sort of risk assessment of these things are possible and they can happen, in building that into your supply chain. So having some redundancies in your supply chain, I think building contingencies plans is probably very helpful in the future.
Yeah. Okay, here's a question. What kind of obstacle did they detect between the lines to be able to pivot, since some coffee shops, as an example here in Mexico, continue to think about returning as they were before the pandemic, and it seems that they did not evolve? This has repercussions on the coffee industry as a whole, doesn't it? I think this question centers around probably, if it wasn't the top word of 2020, it should have been, which was pivot. And the necessity of people changing their everything about their business, their everything. And then this question of the expectation, okay, are we done with the pivot now? Are we pivoting back to exactly what we were in 2019? What are your intuitions about that, Katie?
I think the first part of the question is, what obstacles did they detect?
Oh yeah.
One of the things I think that we discovered that we were surprised about, going back to that question, is that we saw that smaller businesses were more nimble and able to pivot more quickly. I imagine a boat or a ship, maybe because it's just topical, that, a really big ship, it's really hard to pivot and change your direction. But these, smaller businesses or a smaller ship is much more able to pivot and change and adapt to the current situation. I think continuing to be able to evolve even after, the pandemic is over, whenever that, I don't think that'll be a clear line when it's over, but I imagine that thinking about that risk management strategy and building in risk a little bit more, I can imagine that continuing to be able to pivot and be flexible. And I think we've heard this before in some of the other presentations as well, will continue to be a really important skill and competency for all businesses moving forward. I keep mentioning climate change because it's another big, scary thing, but also has the ability to disrupt supply chains, and just being able to think about those possibilities. I can't imagine that ability to evolve will not be a valuable skill to have in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Louisa and Stephen in this session just before us were talking about this very thing, about how small businesses have this nimbleness advantage. And we saw that a little bit in the data, particularly in the June survey. There seemed to be more optimism among small businesses than there were larger chains. I don't want to overreach with this, but I have developed the impression that there are some real advantages that smaller businesses have, or at least, if not smaller businesses who have sort of nimbleness built into their DNA, and have want to be able to change their prices, change their menus, change their service system. The ones that, going back to a year ago, the businesses that were able to, on a dime, move from serving from their counter to serving from their front door or serving on the curb, were the ones that never closed and were way more likely to survive. And so I think the lesson, just as you just said, is this is not the last crisis that we're going to face in our culture. And that nimbleness is just so much. So we undervalue that, I think, as a we maybe overvalue something like consistency or steadfastness, when in fact ability to adapt is maybe much more important. It's another thing that brings out something that I mentioned in my talk, but I want to emphasize, which is, if we would have done a survey like this in 2019, we would have heard a lot about product quality and consumer education, which is our industry saying, our competitive advantage is how delicious our coffee is, and our competitive advantage is how we teach our consumers about coffee. In the context of COVID-19, they were saying the exact opposite. They weren't talking about product quality as often. That's not to say they didn't care about it, but they took that as, instead of a competitive advantage, they took that as a necessary thing. That was just something that they were delivering for sure. And their competitive advantage was how well they were able to listen to their consumers, not tell them about how good the coffee was, but to listen to what they needed and to respond to them. And there's a shift there, I think, for our industry. And I think that's timely, with or without COVID, I think. And I think that's going to be having a permanent effect on our industry, in that, because once you start listening to your customers, you want to do more of it. And I've been hearing that today at this retail summit, yesterday, and some of the speakers, and it's very encouraging because our data shows that that's coming through in the survey responses as well. All right, can any inferences be made of a channel shift from specialty shops to grocery retail? If so, how big a shift? Did you watch the session with the Rabobank podcast team yesterday?
I saw a quick snippet of it. Did you happen to catch it?
They talked about this a little bit, and it's something that also at 1 o'clock, Bill Murray from the National Coffee Association is going to talk about this topic as well. It would have been tough to see in our survey the shift from specialty shops to groceries, since we didn't have very many respondents from grocery. So but I do think that there's there's definitely indications of the losses that happened in specialty shops were taken up by grocery, mainly because overall consumption of coffee in the United States has not gone down a lot, if maybe at all. So so people have to be getting their coffee somewhere, and it's clear that especially coffee shops took a hit, and then if so, and the ones that didn't were selling coffee over the internet or home delivery or something, and shored up their sales that way. It's clear that grocery has taken up some of the slack, as well as online. So quantifying that is going to be difficult. That's actually a little bit more of a project than it may seem. But one of the most encouraging things, though, about the shift, and again, the Rabobank team, and especially James Watson, we're talking about this yesterday, is the biggest growth channel in grocery. The biggest growth has been seen in whole bean coffee sales. And whole bean coffee is a great proxy for specialty coffee in the grocery thing. So the other really interesting indicator is this big growth in home brewing devices. I think Bill's going to talk about that later. It's something like that segment, the home coffee brewing devices, have increased in 2020 something like 25 or 30%. And that is, so that means that's home consumption of coffee, of which a huge proportion is grocery. So the other thing that I've seen here in Southern California is that grocery offerings are more diverse than they've ever been. You still have, roasted and ground coffee in a can, instant coffee, all that stuff. But here in Southern California anyway, and I'm interested in people's experiences in other parts of the country, you can get high-end specialty coffee in grocery stores, in Target, in places like that. I mean, I was in Target the other day, and there were, Black and Bold, Counterculture, Intelligentsia, all these brands, these really specialty brands, that are right there on the shelf available to me. A selection of specialty coffee in Target. It's an amazing thing. So, any thoughts about how we might document this shift?
I think we need more market data, to be honest. That's something that we get asked so much. What percent of the coffee market is specialty coffee? And it's surprisingly difficult data to come across. If we have whole bean, which we use as a proxy, I think it's difficult, much more difficult than folks would imagine to grab that data. So I think, my bias is I like surveys and I like data, but I think we do need more data to understand the shifts.
Well, with that in mind, I think to all the people watching here, we're on a little bit of a platform, speaking to a bunch of the coffee community, and you all are looking at the core of the SCAA research team, and we love to answer questions we answer, chemistry questions and scientific questions, and that's what we use research to do. But this kind of market research is a really important part of what we do. But what we want to do is we want to do research that is valuable to all of you who are hearing our voices here. So I'll maybe close by making the appeal that, you can reach out to research@scaa.coffee, and if or on social media or whatever, or here in the chat, we'd love to know what particular questions are of interest to you. This grocery thing, I'm interested. I'm grateful for that question, because that tells me that that's something that we can document and it will be valuable to our community. But those kinds of questions are very valuable to us, and we want to help answer them. So, and that's what kind of we exist to do. So, we encourage you to reach out to us, visit the SCA research site where we house a lot of research, please make use of this. We produce this for the community. So now with that in mind, the idea of more research and getting access to research after the event, I should mention something about Retail Summit. So if you're interested in this kind of research that we've been talking about, and other research too, we've removed the paywall from a lot of the research that existed before. There was some research that we published behind a paywall for SCA, and we removed that in honor of this event, the Retail Summit. So you can find that housed on the Retail Summit site. If there's a Explore Library link at the top of the screen, and you can use the search and filter function, and there's topic areas. And if you filter for market research, you'll see a lot of research that we've done over the years that now is available to you free for the first time. So please avail yourself of that research. We'd love to hear your questions and feedback. And so with that, I think we'll bring this to a close. There's time for a cup of coffee before the next session, which is about real estate, the current landscape for retail. So with that, thank you, Katie.
Thanks, Peter.
Was fun hanging out. Thank you all the sponsors that you can see here on the slide, and join me for the next session in 6 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.